It began on a night when the stars seemed to hum. Not loudly, not like a song one could catch with ears, but softly, like the universe itself was breathing just outside the window. I remember the first moment I noticed it, though I barely understood what it was. A small vibration in the air, a whispering tug at the edge of thought, the kind of feeling that lingers even after your eyes are closed. That night, the world felt both impossibly large and intimately tender, as though it had bent itself just for a single heart to explore. And in that quiet, I want you to know truly that we love you, that the universe, though vast and unending, has always cared for your small, luminous self. Before we begin the story, tell us, where in the world are you watching from and what time is it there? Now let's get started. Rick was a boy with hair like the softest grey light, the kind that seemed to settle gently on the nape of your neck. He lived in a town that was neither here nor entirely elsewhere, a place where the wind carried 1,000 faint smells. Honey, rain-soaked earth, the tang of metal, and the clouds seemed to linger, hovering in shapes that might have been forgotten dreams. He didn't always understand why his thoughts drifted the way they did, or why he often stared at the sky as if it might answer his questions if only he waited long enough. His curiosity was not loud. It was a soft, insistent pulse, like the gentle flicker of a candle in a vast, quiet room. The first time the portal appeared, it was not with a flare or the dramatic hum of some great invention. It simply shimmered on the wall of his small room, a circular glow no larger than a teacup, bending the light around it in gentle ripples. Rick had been staring at it for what felt like an eternity, though it may have been only moments, and for the first time he felt a thrill that did not rush, but unfolded like a slow tide. He touched the edge with a trembling finger, expecting perhaps heat or cold, but there was nothing tangible, only a soft, vibrating sense of possibility. The portal was a question, not an answer, and that alone filled him with awe. His home smelled faintly of wood smoke and old books, the kind of books that hold more than words, that carry the scent of someone's fingers and laughter from decades past. In the corner of the room, an old clock ticked steadily, and each tick seemed to echo through the portal, marking time in a way that made the boy's chest tighten with longing he didn't yet name. Rick's parents were kind in a way that sometimes confused him. They gave him freedom without weight, space without neglect. He remembered sitting on the steps outside, letting the wind lift his hair, while the soft murmur of his mother's lullabies floated through the house. He didn't always understand her words, but he understood her heart. That understanding, small and warm, planted itself in him like a seed, ready to grow in quiet ways. The first nights with the portal were always the same. Rick would watch it, hesitant and curious, until the soft pull of sleep drew him close. And even as his eyelids drooped, the portal seemed to sigh, a gentle exhale of light and possibility, whispering in a language he felt rather than heard. He dreamed then of other worlds, not grand adventures, but small, intimate corners of reality where the air shimmered and the stars hung like lanterns over streets lined with quiet wonder. In his dreams he wandered slowly, noticing everything: the curve of a tree branch, the glint of dew on a forgotten window, the soft sigh of someone else's sleep. It was during one of these dreamlike nights that he first began to notice his own peculiar skill. Not a talent anyone could see from the outside, no feats of strength or speed, but something subtler, a stretching of attention, an openness of thought, a softness that allowed him to feel the weight of another's heart without carrying it harshly. His hands, when he reached out, seemed to understand before he did. His eyes, when he looked, saw the edges of emotion that most overlooked. It was as if the portal had taught him to observe gently, to linger in quiet spaces where others hurried past. Rick's world was full of small companions, a moth that rested on the edge of his window each evening, a stray cat whose tail swished like a slow metronome, and sometimes the neighbor boy, who didn't speak much but whose presence alone was comforting. He learned early that relationships need not be loud to matter. The portal taught him patience. The moth taught him presence. The cat taught him humility. And slowly, day by day, these quiet teachers shaped the boy into someone who could notice the unseen currents of the universe and move through them with care rather than fear. Even in the mundane, there was magic. A dropped sandwich on a rainy day could become a fleeting lesson in impermanence. A flicker of candlelight on a damp evening could awaken wonder. Rick collected these moments as if they were stars, small points of light in the otherwise ordinary sky. Each memory was soft, each sensation delicate, each emotion a thread that bound him to the world with gentle insistence. And through it all, the portal remained, a silent witness, a subtle guide, a question that never demanded an answer. And so, as the nights grew long and the stars hummed ever softer, Rick learned to wait, to watch, to breathe in the tiny, quiet miracles that brushed past him like whispers. He learned that it was not the grand gestures that mattered, but the careful tending of small hearts, the noticing of tiny lights in the dark, the gentle acknowledgement of life as it quietly unfolded. And in the softest hours, when the portal pulsed like a heartbeat just beyond his reach, Rick felt the universe lean closer, and he leaned back with it, letting sleep carry him through its endless, luminous corridors and somewhere. He knew that this was only the beginning. The quiet beginnings, the tender origins, were always the ones that carried the most weight, if one listened closely enough. And we are listening with you, right now in this moment, soft and still, as the stars hum and the portal glows faintly beyond the edges of sight. The days that followed the first shimmer of the portal were quiet, yet full of soft revelation. Rick moved through them as though he were walking along the edge of a lake at dawn, careful not to disturb the fragile surface, listening to the way the water held the light. Each morning, he awoke to the familiar smells of wood smoke and honey, of bread baking somewhere down the street, of rain lingering in the stone cracks of the pavement outside. The world seemed to him both infinite and intimate, as if every corner of it had been waiting for someone small and tender to notice. And he noticed with careful patience, because he had begun to understand that attention was a gift, and that the act of noticing could change a place as subtly as the wind shifts the leaves on a tree. It was in this time that he discovered his unusual inheritance. Not the kind that arrives with fanfare, not a shining medal or a letter with embossed edges, but a quiet, almost imperceptible gift, like a reflection that only appears when you tilt your head just right. His father, who spoke sparingly, but with a softness that lingered long after words had faded, often left small tools and strange devices lying about the workshop at the back of the house. Rick had learned early to move among them gently, to touch without haste, to observe without judgment. One evening, he picked up a small cylindrical object, cold and smooth, with buttons too delicate for clumsy fingers. The object hummed faintly, like it was breathing, like it was aware that it had been found by someone patient enough to care. And in that moment he understood that some inheritances were not objects to be owned, but lessons to be absorbed slowly and quietly. Until they became a part of you, his mother watched him, often from across the room, a faint smile tucked into the corners of her mouth. She had a way of letting him discover the world on his own, of holding back the urge to instruct, while still providing the warmth of safety. Rick learned from her the subtle rhythms of connection, the small acts of kindness that ripple outward without fanfare, a hand left on a shoulder for a moment longer than necessary, a nod of understanding when words fail, a shared slice of bread with honey when someone seems quietly lost in thought. These gestures, seemingly trivial, became the quiet architecture of his understanding. He began to see the world as a series of soft exchanges, delicate and meaningful, each one shaping the currents of life in ways that could never be fully measured. The portal pulsed intermittently, like a heartbeat beneath the surface of reality, and Rick often returned to it, drawn by something he could not yet name. He touched it gently, tracing the edges with his fingertips, feeling the faint warmth of possibility. Sometimes he would peer into it and see colors that made no sense, shapes that whispered of other lives, other streets, other quiet corners of existence. And in those moments, he understood that his curiosity was not a fleeting whim, but a kind of loyalty to wonder, to connection, to the slow unfolding of life itself. The portal, though silent, was his companion, a subtle guide through the quiet architecture of the universe. One afternoon, while the sun was slanting across the walls in gentle bands of gold and amber, Rick met someone new, a boy from a neighboring street, quiet, observant, whose laughter was soft and whose eyes lingered too long on things most people overlooked. Their first conversation was halting, made up of pauses and small observations, the way a cloud rested on a rooftop, the smell of damp earth after rain, the faint metallic tang of old tools left on a bench. There was no rush, no need for grand words or declarations, just two small souls recognizing each other in the quiet folds of the day. From that afternoon onward, they would meet often, wandering the streets or sitting beneath the edge of a tree, speaking softly about the things that mattered most in ways that mattered least to anyone else. Rick discovered, through these small bonds, that growth did not require drama. It required presence. He learned that a word spoken at the right time, a hand extended when it is least expected, a patient smile when confusion clouds understanding, could open doors no louder than the quiet pulse of his own heart. The portal remained at the edge of his world, a gentle reminder that there were places beyond the familiar, places that waited patiently for those willing to look, to reach, to breathe. And he learned to move slowly toward them, carrying with him the tenderness he had inherited from home, from love, from the quiet rhythms of existence. In the evenings, when the sky shifted into shades of soft indigo and violet, Rick would sit by his window watching the first stars appear. He noticed their tiny, steadfast presence, how they seemed to hold the dark at bay, not with force, but with persistence. Sometimes he imagined the portal opening among them, spilling light into his room, filling it with echoes of distant laughter, distant wind, distant possibilities. And he understood, in the slow unfolding of his heart, that every small act, every patient gaze, every whispered kindness had its own kind of gravity. It pulled the universe gently closer, shaping it with care rather than command, folding it into the quiet geometry of connection. By the time he lay down to sleep, his hands still faintly tingling from contact with the portal, his mind would drift through memories and soft imaginings. He thought of his mother humming while washing dishes, of the boy from the neighboring street tracing shapes in the air with his fingers, of the cat that purred its slow, steady song by the fire. Each image, each sensation was a small star in the constellation of his understanding, and somewhere beneath it all, the portal pulsed like a heartbeat, a quiet reminder that there were always more doors to notice, more edges of the universe to touch, more wonders to attend with tender care. And as sleep finally came, Rick understood, even without speaking the words, that this was how growth began, not in leaps or battles or triumphs, but in gentle observation, in soft inheritance, in the slow nurturing of relationships that carried warmth without asking for repayment. It was the quiet courage of noticing, the bravery of lingering, the humility of attending. And somewhere, in the muted glow of the room, in the soft pulse of the portal, in the gentle rhythm of a boy's heart, learning to stretch beyond itself. The universe leaned closer, welcoming him into its vast, tender fold. The first time Rick truly stepped through the portal, it was not with fanfare or excitement. The room was quiet, shadows stretching along the floorboards, and the faint hum of the portal filled the space like a gentle heartbeat. He had spent countless evenings observing it, touching its edges, feeling the subtle warmth beneath his fingertips. And now, with the soft courage of a child who has learned patience, he pressed forward, letting himself dissolve into the fold of light and possibility. It was not a leap, it was a breath, a subtle shift, a quiet yielding to something larger than himself. The world on the other side was unlike anything he had imagined. Not vast cities or dangerous landscapes, but a place small and intimate, filled with a kind of soft luminescence that seemed to seep into the air itself. Grass that shimmered with the faintest green glow brushed his ankles, and trees bent gently toward him as though bowing in quiet acknowledgement. The sky was a gradient of deep violet and tender gold, and clouds drifted lazily, casting delicate shadows on the ground. He moved slowly, letting each step carry him through the subtle poetry of this strange, gentle land. It felt like walking inside a memory he had not yet lived. Rick noticed the creatures first in the edges of his vision. Small, translucent beings that floated like drifting feathers, their forms pulsing faintly with light. They made no sound, yet he felt their presence in the soft tremor of the air, the way the portal's hum followed him even here. He did not need to understand them, did not need to name them or claim them. He simply observed, feeling a gentle thrill in the realization that the world beyond the portal existed for reasons beyond comprehension, for reasons that had nothing to do with his expectations. And in that observation, he felt a kind of quiet companionship, a thread connecting him to life in forms he had not yet learned to speak to. Time here moved differently. Minutes stretched into long sighs and hours passed unnoticed, braided into the rhythm of light and wind. Rick wandered along a path of softly glowing stones, each one warm beneath his feet. He came to a small stream that reflected the sky in liquid gold, its surface trembling as if breathing. He knelt and cupped the water in his hands, watching as it shimmered and folded itself into shapes he could not name. He realized without words that this place held not only possibility but reflection, the reflection of all the small choices, quiet acts and gentle attentions that had carried him to this moment. In the distance, a faint melody rose as if the air itself was singing. It was not loud, not intrusive, but a whisper that curled around him like a familiar memory. Rick followed it without haste, stepping carefully, feeling the soft pulse of the land beneath him. He arrived at a circle of stones larger than he could measure, and at the center was a single, glowing flower. Its petals shimmered with colors that seemed borrowed from his own heart, soft blues, tender golds, gentle pinks. As he approached, the melody grew clearer, a lullaby that spoke not with words, but with feeling. It reminded him of the nights at home, of his mother humming while the rain pressed against the windows, of the boy from the neighboring street tracing shapes in the air with quiet concentration. Rick reached out and touched the flower. There was no magic in the way the stories of old described it, no flash of light or dramatic change. Instead, there was understanding. The flower bent toward him, and he felt the weight of all he had noticed, all he had learned, all the soft attentions that had shaped his life. He understood without a single word that the portal, the worlds beyond it, the creatures, the light, were not prizes or tools or games. They were mirrors. They reflected not what he could take from them, but what he had cultivated inside himself: patience, empathy, the courage to linger, the willingness to notice, the capacity for wonder. The hours passed as he sat there, breathing in the scent of the glowing petals, listening to the faint hum of the air, feeling the pulse of life in its quiet rhythms. He did not speak. There was no need. The portal's presence followed him, a subtle thread tethering him to the world he had left behind, to the room where the shadows stretched along the floorboards, and the soft hum of possibility waited patiently. Rick felt the slow unfolding of time, the gentle layering of experience, the quiet revelation that growth was never loud or dramatic. It was a slow, breathing thing, a soft spiral of understanding that carried him forward, even when he thought he had reached the edge of his own perception. Eventually, the pull of home drew him back. He stepped through the portal as he had entered, slowly, gently, feeling the familiar texture of floorboards beneath his feet, the faint scent of wood smoke and honey, the soft weight of his small room around him. The portal shimmered once, then dimmed, its hum folding into the quiet of the evening. Rick sat down by the window, looking out at the first stars of the night. He could still feel the pulse of the glowing flower, the subtle companionship of creatures he had only glimpsed, the lullaby that lingered in the corners of his mind. It was not excitement that filled him, nor triumph, nor fear. It was reflection, the quiet awe of understanding something larger than himself, not in order to control it, but to inhabit it gently. He thought of the small acts that had carried him here, noticing a moth on the windowsill, listening to the neighbor boy's quiet laughter, holding a hand extended without expectation. The portal had not taken him to a new world. It had revealed the world already within him. The world made of patient observation, gentle empathy, and the quiet courage to linger. Rick leaned against the sill, the night settling softly around him. The portal remained at the edge of his room, a soft glow against the shadows, waiting without insistence. He closed his eyes and let his breathing fall into the rhythm of the stars outside, the rhythm of the glowing flower, the rhythm of a life unfolding quietly, patiently. He understood, as children sometimes do in the deepest hours before sleep, that growth was not a race or a conquest. It was a slow opening, a gentle revealing, a willingness to be present in every fragile, luminous moment. And somewhere, in that quiet communion of light, shadow, and the hum of possibility, Rick felt the first true pulse of wonder, the steady acknowledgement that the universe was both vast and tender, and that he, in his soft, observing way, belonged wholly within it. He did not speak, and yet the portal hummed a gentle greeting, a quiet exhale of light, a reflection of patience and care. And he, in turn, exhaled, letting the night carry him forward, letting the world teach him, letting the quiet companionship of the unknown become part of his small, luminous heart. Rick's days began to fold into one another, stitched together by quiet moments and subtle discoveries. The portal pulsed gently in the corner of his room, a constant presence, neither demanding attention nor fading into nothing. He had begun to understand that it did not belong to him in any conventional sense. It existed as a mirror, a teacher, a quiet invitation to notice. And slowly, he was learning to listen, not to the noise of possibility, but to the delicate language of life, of others, of small hearts that required only the softest touch to be understood. One morning, he found the neighbor boy waiting by the edge of the garden, hands tucked into his pockets, a faint smile hovering on his face. Rick had grown accustomed to these meetings, these silent exchanges that held more meaning than conversation could ever carry. Today the boy held a small notebook, edges frayed, pages curling slightly with dampness from the night's rain. He handed it to Rick without a word, and Rick felt the quiet weight of trust, the unspoken gift of shared attention. He opened it slowly, and inside were sketches, soft, delicate shapes, observations of clouds, plants, the subtle bend of a branch under the wind, the play of light on water. Each drawing felt alive, infused with the careful noticing that Rick had been learning to practice himself. They wandered together that morning, following the path of sunlight spilling over rooftops, listening to the soft whisper of leaves. Rick noticed how the neighbor boy's gaze lingered, how his fingers traced patterns in the air, as if the world were a living canvas. He felt a warmth in the rhythm of their footsteps, the gentle cadence of two quiet presences moving side by side, and he understood, more clearly than he had before, that connection was not measured by words or by action, but by attention, by the willingness to linger, to notice, to breathe in the small miracles of shared time. The portal, faint and pulsing, seemed to echo their steps, its light bending subtly toward them as though acknowledging the care with which they moved through the day. Rick had begun to sense that every act, however small, carried a resonance. A leaf dropped into a puddle could ripple outward in ways no one could measure. A hand extended without expectation could warm the heart of someone quietly lost. A smile offered at the precise moment could fold the edges of despair into something manageable, something tender. He carried these truths like a soft armor, not for protection, but for awareness, for the slow cultivation of presence. Later, beneath the faint shade of a tree, Rick and the boy paused. The sunlight filtered through the leaves, scattering gold across the ground. Rick reached out and touched the trunk, feeling the pulse of life beneath the bark. The boy watched him silently, eyes wide with that kind of quiet curiosity that mirrors understanding. Rick realized then that empathy, patience, and observation were not abstract lessons but living skills, small powers that could shape moments into meaning. The portal had not given him a tool for escape or adventure. It had shown him the architecture of subtle influence, the gentle craft of noticing, of being, of attending to life's soft insistence. They walked on, through the narrow streets where rain had left puddles that reflected the pale sky, through gardens where flowers bent gracefully beneath the weight of dew. Rick noticed the small creatures that inhabited the margins, insects that shimmered faintly, birds that dipped low in silent flight, a moth that had returned to his windowsill without explanation. Every motion, every sound, every scent became a part of the slow lesson. Rick realized that he was learning not to dominate, not to change, but to harmonize, to move within the rhythms of the world without disturbing its fragile balance. In the evenings, Rick returned to the portal, carrying with him the soft awareness he had gathered through the day. He placed his hands gently on its surface, feeling the warmth of its hum, feeling the echo of all he had seen, heard, and understood. Sometimes he would peer through it, seeing faint traces of the worlds beyond, colors that seemed borrowed from memory and emotion, shapes that hinted at places both real and imagined. And though he did not step through, not yet, he felt the quiet pull of possibility, the gentle insistence that there was more to notice, more to observe, more to fold into the delicate constellation of his understanding. Rick's parents, too, had begun to notice the subtle changes in him. His father, who rarely spoke beyond necessity, would sometimes place a hand on Rick's shoulder, a light, grounding touch. His mother continued her soft rituals, humming while she worked, leaving small notes in unexpected places, offering a slice of bread with honey when she sensed quiet longing. These gestures, simple and unassuming, were lessons in their own right, teaching him that connection is cultivated not with grand demonstrations, but with the persistent practice of care. And Rick absorbed them, storing them in the quiet corridors of his mind, letting them shape the way he moved, the way he breathed, the way he attended to the world. One night, as the stars began to hum their familiar lullaby, Rick sat by the window, notebook open, and sketched the patterns of light and shadow that fell across the floor. The neighbor boy had given him new eyes, new patience, new understanding. He drew not for mastery, not for recognition, but to honor the small moments, the tiny pulses of life that often pass unnoticed. Each line, each shade, each careful stroke was an act of empathy, a quiet affirmation that the world is alive in ways that demand only that we be present, that we notice, that we attend, and somewhere, beneath the hum of the portal, beneath the faint rustle of leaves outside, beneath the pulse of the quiet night, Rick understood that growth is neither loud nor sudden. It is a slow, unbroken unfolding, a careful tending of small truths, a patient weaving of empathy, attention, and presence. And he knew that in these moments, the gentle footsteps beside him, the soft glow of the portal, the warmth of home, the careful noticing of life, he was learning the true rhythm of being, the quiet power of presence, the gentle magic of simply attending to the world with an open heart. The days grew longer, stretching softly into one another like ribbons of mist over a quiet morning. Rick began to notice the small rhythms that had always been there, unnoticed, until he gave them his attention. The way the sunlight filtered through the leaves in slow, lazy patterns, the hum of the wind through the chimneys, the subtle pulse of the town itself, as if it breathed quietly beneath the pavement and rooftops. He had begun to understand that noticing was not merely seeing, but listening, feeling, letting the edges of perception expand to hold things previously invisible. And he did this with a gentle patience, the kind that allowed the world to reveal itself without rush or demand. One afternoon, he found himself wandering along the edge of a stream, its surface catching the sunlight in fractured diamonds. The neighbor boy was there, crouched at the water's edge, tossing tiny pebbles that made ripples curl outward in perfect symmetry. Rick knelt beside him, letting his hands skim the cool water, feeling its flow around his fingers, feeling the quiet gravity of these small acts. They did not speak much, yet each movement, each glance, each subtle shift in posture carried understanding. He realized then that words were not always necessary. Presence could speak with a depth that conversation often could not. It was during moments like these that Rick began to notice his own capacity for empathy unfolding. The portal, quietly pulsing in the corner of his room, seemed to mirror this expansion. It no longer demanded his attention in the sharp way of a question. It now breathed alongside him, a gentle companion in the soft art of noticing. He touched it lightly, feeling a warmth that seemed to echo the care he was learning to extend outward, and he understood, without conscious thought, that this was the nature of quiet power, subtle, patient, growing in small gestures and soft attentions. The neighbor boy, whose name Rick still found strange and full of music when he said it aloud, laughed quietly as a dragonfly skimmed the water's surface. Rick noticed how his laughter lingered, as though reluctant to vanish, and he realized that shared observation, shared presence, could be a language all its own. He began to see that relationships were not built in dramatic gestures or grand adventures, but in these understated moments, the ones that slip by unnoticed unless one slows enough to see them. He reached out and placed a hand lightly on the boy's shoulder, and the boy leaned into it, a gesture of trust, as gentle as the flowing stream. Rick's own home reflected this quiet growth. His mother continued her soft attentions, leaving small reminders of care in the kitchen, a note folded into the pages of a book, a cloth hung with a faint scent of lavender. His father would sometimes set a hand on Rick's shoulder, not to guide, but to acknowledge presence, the subtle pulse of encouragement. Rick absorbed these moments like seeds falling onto fertile soil. He began to notice the edges of kindness that others often overlooked. A chair left slightly pulled out for someone, a curtain drawn back to let light spill in, a door left open in case someone needed to pass without being seen. These were the gestures that built connection, that whispered understanding, that allowed life to move gently forward. One evening, As the sky deepened into shades of violet and indigo, Rick returned to the portal with a sense of quiet reverence. He sat beside it, tracing its faintly shimmering edge with a fingertip, feeling the gentle thrum beneath his skin. He had begun to realize that the portal was not simply a doorway to other places. It was a reflection of his own growing capacity to hold space for things beyond himself, to notice without needing to change, to observe without control. He closed his eyes and let the soft hum surround him, letting the light fold into his memory, letting the quiet lessons of the day sink into his bones. The moon rose slowly, brushing the town in silver and lavender light, and Rick felt the pulse of the world around him. The portal shimmered faintly, its rhythm aligning with the quiet heartbeat of the night. He thought of the neighbor boy's soft laughter, of the way the stream had curved around stones, of the wings of the moth resting patiently on his windowsill. All of it, he realized, was a web of small, careful attentions, each one a thread connecting life in ways too subtle to name. He understood that growth, like the gentle rise and fall of the tide, is not a matter of force, but of presence, patience, and careful noticing. In the hours before sleep, Rick lay on the floor by the window, notebook open, sketching the patterns of light and shadow that the moon cast across the walls. The strokes of his pencil were deliberate, soft, and slow, capturing not detail for mastery, but detail for understanding. He drew the curve of a leaf, the ripple of water, the faint shimmer of the portal's edge. Each mark was a quiet meditation, a soft acknowledgement that to notice is to participate, to honor, to hold with care. And as he drew, he felt the faint echo of the worlds beyond the portal, not as distant places to conquer, but as extensions of the gentle attentiveness he was cultivating within himself. Rick's capacity to care grew in tandem with his understanding of subtlety. He began to notice the quiet changes in others, the tremor of hesitation in a friend, the soft weight of sorrow in a neighbor, the fleeting spark of joy in a stranger. Each observation became an opportunity to extend the small, patient gestures that had shaped him, a nod, a hand offered, a presence maintained without intrusion. The portal remained at the edge of the room, pulsing faintly, a reminder that all these worlds, inside him and beyond, were connected by the same gentle law. Attention, care, and quiet, patient wonder. By the time sleep arrived, Rick's mind was folded into the rhythms he had observed all day. The whisper of water, the faint pulse of the portal, the slow breathing of the town outside, the tiny flutter of moth wings in the corner of his room. He understood, in a way words could not capture, that the quiet power he was learning to cultivate was the ability to notice fully, to hold space for life, and to move through the world with gentle attention. And somewhere, beneath the hum of the portal, beneath the silver sweep of moonlight, beneath the soft tapestry of the night, he felt the steady, reassuring pulse of possibility, of growth, of connection. An invisible thread that bound him to everything he had noticed, and everything he had yet to see. Evenings had begun to settle into a pattern of quiet reflection for Rick. The light of the sky softened into a slow gradient of lavender and pale indigo, carrying with it the faint hum of the town's nocturnal rhythm. The portal in the corner pulsed faintly, no longer startling, no longer demanding, merely existing as a gentle presence at the edge of awareness. Rick often sat beside it, letting his fingers hover above the shimmer of light, feeling the warmth ripple across his skin, and he thought about the rhythm of days, the shape of presence, and the soft weight of understanding that grew with observation. The neighbor boy came often now, walking beside Rick without need for plans or schedules, just the natural inclination to share quiet space. They wandered through gardens where dew collected on petals like tiny lamps, across streets where puddles mirrored the fractured light of street lamps, and under the slow sway of trees that bent their branches with gentle care. Each step was deliberate, not hurried, and Rick began to feel the world as a living poem, unfolding slowly around him. He noticed how the boy's gaze lingered on the smallest details, how his hands moved lightly, tracing air and leaves without intent, without performance. This kind of observation, Rick realized, was a soft power, a gentle mastery of presence. One afternoon, they found themselves beneath the old willow at the far edge of the park. Its branches dipped low, brushing the soft grass, creating a natural canopy of green and shadow. Rick leaned back against the trunk and closed his eyes, letting the sound of wind in the leaves fill him. The neighbor boy lay nearby, tracing patterns in the dirt with a stick, watching the way the shadows shifted with subtle curiosity. No words were spoken, yet both of them felt the connection, the quiet communion of two small presences aware of one another and the soft, unfolding world. The portal would wait in Rick's room, humming quietly, but here, in this shared silence, Rick understood that connection and presence were not bound by place. At home, the days were similarly quiet, yet full of lessons disguised as ordinary moments. Rick's mother hummed while she prepared evening meals, the gentle vibration of her voice weaving through the kitchen and spilling into the hallways. Rick noticed the soft pattern of her hands moving through familiar motions, the care in which she arranged plates and utensils, the way she left a little extra light on the table for someone who might need it. He began to see these acts not as domestic routines, but as meditations, as small constellations of care and attention that shaped the life around them. Each act was a soft ripple, and he understood that life itself was composed of these quiet, attentive gestures. The portal seemed to respond to this rhythm of quiet noticing. Its pulse softened, a steady thrum that aligned with the slower beat of Rick's own heart. When he placed his hand against its edge, he could feel the resonance of his days, the hours spent noticing the neighbor boy, the humming of his mother, the small creatures that flitted through the garden, the patterns of clouds drifting across the sky. Rick began to sense that the portal was less a doorway than a reflection, a quiet echo of the attentiveness he cultivated daily. Its light no longer startled him. It invited him to fold observation, care, and patience into his growing understanding. One evening, as a soft mist drifted through the town, Rick and the neighbor boy wandered to the stream at the edge of the park. Water lapped over smooth stones, carrying the faint scent of earth and rain. The boy stooped and picked up a pebble, letting it skip across the surface of the water, each hop sending ripples outward in slow, deliberate rhythm. Rick traced a finger along the cool edge of the stream, watching the patterns of movement, the tiny whirlpools that formed around each stone. In that quiet act, he felt a deep lesson. Small gestures, carefully placed, have the power to shape the world in ways often unseen but deeply felt. He realized that this was the kind of mastery the portal had been teaching him, not of space or worlds, but of presence, care, and subtle influence. The nights were particularly profound. Rick often returned to his room just as the first stars began to hum faintly in the sky, the town softened by distance and shadow. He sat by the portal, closing his eyes and letting the gentle light wash over his face, letting the faint hum fill the room like a soft lullaby. Memories of the day's quiet moments floated across his mind, the neighbor boy's silent laughter, the way shadows curved on the pavement, the gentle pulse of the willow's branches, the subtle shimmer of insects in the garden. These recollections felt like small lanterns in the dark, each one illuminating a truth he was only beginning to grasp, that life's depth is often found in what is subtle, not in what is loud. Rick began to understand the power of observation as a kind of magic. It did not command or alter, it did not compel or conquer. Instead, it held, it acknowledged, it allowed space for growth. Watching the neighbor boy carefully, listening to the soft hum of his mother, noticing the minutiae of the natural world, he realized that these acts of attention were themselves a kind of quiet heroism. They shaped not just his own perception, but the experience of the world itself, folding it gently into patterns of care and understanding that could travel farther than any portal could reach. On a particularly still night, Rick traced the edges of the portal, feeling its warmth and thought of the worlds beyond, the faint shapes and colors that hinted at vastness. And yet, he did not step through. Instead, he rested in the quiet communion of presence, allowing himself to fold the day's lessons inward. The neighbor boy's laughter, the soft hum of home, the subtle patterns of light and shadow, all of it became a meditation, a gentle practice of empathy, patience, and awareness. Rick realized that the true journey was not in travel or discovery, but in the cultivation of these small attentions, the careful nurturing of the unseen threads that connect life quietly, insistently, beautifully. And as sleep began to press gently against his eyelids, he leaned back against the windowsill, feeling the faint pulse of the portal, the soft hum of the night, the lingering warmth of presence in every small gesture he had witnessed that day. He understood deeply and without needing words that growth is quiet, subtle, and patient. That empathy is a skill cultivated in the careful noticing of the world. That love in its softest form is not an explosion, but a gentle tending. Somewhere beneath the hum of the portal, beneath the silver sweep of stars, beneath the quiet pulse of night, Rick exhaled and allowed himself to fold fully into the rhythm of the world he had begun to understand. The morning was slow, a soft unfolding of pale sunlight over the edges of rooftops and the curve of streets that had long learned to breathe quietly. Rick lingered by his window, watching dust motes drift lazily in the beams of light, and he felt a gentle thrill in noticing their slow dance. The neighbor boy had not yet arrived, and the house was filled with the faint scent of bread baking and wood smoke, a scent that always seemed to carry a quiet message. Life is present, even in its simplest form, even in moments unnoticed by the larger world. Rick breathed in that message, letting it settle into the rhythm of his day. He moved toward the portal as if toward an old friend. Its edges shimmered faintly in the morning light, a delicate pulse that seemed to resonate with the soft vibration of his own awareness. Rick placed his fingers lightly on its surface, feeling warmth radiate through him. He did not step through, not today. Instead, he allowed himself to linger, to notice the subtle hum beneath his touch, to imagine what lay beyond without urgency or expectation. The portal, he realized, was less a destination and more a teacher, showing him the art of patient observation, of quiet curiosity, of careful, empathetic engagement with the world. The neighbor boy appeared then, footsteps soft on the cobblestones, a faint smile already tugging at the corners of his mouth. They met at the edge of the garden, where dew lingered like tiny lanterns on each blade of grass. No words were needed. Their shared presence carried its own rhythm, a subtle music of attention and understanding. Rick watched the way the boy's hands traced the edges of leaves, the way his gaze followed the slow drift of a moth in the air. Every movement was deliberate yet unforced, and Rick felt the echo of the portal's lessons in the quiet unfolding of this morning ritual. They wandered through the streets, stepping carefully around puddles left from last night's rain. Rick noticed the reflection of the sky in each one, the way it fractured and curved across stones and cracks, how tiny ripples shifted patterns he had only just begun to see. He thought about how small acts, dropping a pebble, shifting a leaf, pausing to notice, could create echoes in ways that were invisible but deeply felt. The neighbor boy paused at a corner, pointing toward a faint shimmer in the distance, and Rick realized it was a light caught on broken glass, refracted into soft gold. They crouched together, watching it ripple, the world holding still around them. He felt the quiet joy of shared attention, the kind that needed no words, only presence, patience, and care. Later they came to the willow at the far edge of the park. Its branches curved low, brushing the ground, creating a natural sanctuary of shade and quiet. Rick leaned against the trunk, feeling the texture of bark and the pulse of life beneath it. The boys sat nearby, drawing shapes in the soft soil, tracing spirals and patterns that seemed to echo the gentle hum of the portal back home. Rick realized that this was another form of dialogue, a conversation not of words, but of observation and resonance. Each curve, each line, each subtle movement was a way of holding space for understanding, for empathy, for connection without intrusion or demand. At home, Rick's mother hummed softly while preparing the evening meal. He noticed the rhythm in her movements, the tender care she infused into each task, slicing bread, setting the table, wiping a surface with slow, deliberate motion. It was a quiet choreography, a series of gestures that carried warmth without words, teaching Rick once again that attention and care were small acts with profound resonance. Rick sat quietly, tracing the edge of the table with a fingertip, allowing the soft pattern of her presence to imprint on him, to become part of his growing understanding of the world's subtle currents. Evening fell slowly, brushing the town with muted violet and gold. Rick returned to the portal, sitting beside it as the soft pulse of light filled the room. He let his hands hover above the shimmering surface, feeling its warmth fold into his awareness, feeling the echo of the day's gentle lessons. Each small act of noticing, each patient observation, each shared moment of presence with the neighbor boy and his family carried a subtle weight, a quiet gravity that shaped him in ways he had only begun to comprehend. The portal's glow seemed to respond, pulsing in gentle rhythm, as if acknowledging the quiet growth that had taken place within him. Rick thought about empathy, not as a concept, but as a practice. It was the careful act of noticing without judgment, the willingness to hold space for others, the subtle skill of observing and responding with care rather than force. It was the art of patience, of presence, of quiet heroism in small, everyday moments. He thought of the neighbor boy's quiet laughter, the soft hum of his mother's work, the small creatures that flitted along the garden's edge, and he realized that the world was filled with opportunities for such gentle attentiveness. Growth, he understood, was not measured in loud victories or dramatic transformations, but in these subtle, patient acts of care. As night deepened, Rick lay on the floor by the window, notebook open, pencil tracing delicate lines and shapes. He sketched the curve of the willow, the glimmer of the stream, the shimmer of light across puddles, the soft edge of the portal's glow. Each line was an act of meditation, a reflection of the quiet attentiveness he had cultivated. He drew not for mastery or display, but for understanding, for honoring the small, unnoticed rhythms that shaped the world around him. Each stroke was a soft exhale, a folding of observation and empathy into the fabric of memory. Rick closed his notebook and leaned back against the windowsill, letting the night envelop him. The portal pulsed faintly in the corner, a quiet companion in the stillness. He felt the connection between all he had noticed, the neighbor boy's patient presence, the mother's humming, the gentle rhythms of wind and water, the pulse of the willow's branches. Everything was linked in subtle resonance, in quiet gravity, in the slow, deliberate unfolding of attention. He understood that this was the magic the portal had revealed, not the traversal of space, but the cultivation of awareness, care, and presence. Somewhere, in the hum of the portal, the rustle of leaves, the faint shimmer of stars outside, Rick felt a quiet exhale, a sense of being fully present in a world that was both intimate and vast. The neighbor boy's laughter, the soft light of home, the delicate pulse of creatures in the garden, all of it threaded together into a quiet tapestry of understanding. He breathed deeply, letting the gentle rhythm of life settle within him, letting presence become a practice, letting empathy become a companion, letting quiet wonder unfold slowly, deliberately, lovingly, into every corner of his being. The morning light arrived soft and hesitant, brushing the edges of rooftops with a pale, forgiving gold. Rick lingered by the window, letting the world awake slowly around him. The air carried the faint scent of dew and damp earth, a quiet reminder that growth comes gently, often unseen until one pauses to notice it. The portal in the corner pulsed faintly, a subtle rhythm, a quiet companion to the unfolding day. Rick moved toward it, fingers brushing the edges of its shimmer, feeling warmth radiate through his hand. He did not step through, not yet. Today was for observation, for noticing, for letting small moments settle into memory. The neighbor boy arrived soon after, a smile already forming as he approached the garden's edge. Their greetings were silent, a simple nod, a shared breath, a presence acknowledged without interruption. Rick watched the boy's hands trace the edges of leaves, the delicate curves of petals, the tiny movements of insects as they moved through the soft light. Each gesture was deliberate, unforced, and carried a quiet meaning that words could never capture. Rick felt the rhythm of attention settle into him, a growing awareness that these small acts were more potent than any grand adventure, more lasting than any hurried excitement. They wandered to the stream, stepping carefully over stones and shallow puddles. Rick noticed how the water caught the sunlight, fracturing it into soft beams that danced across the surface. The boy picked up a pebble and let it skip, each hop sending ripples outward in patterns that seemed to mirror the slow pulse of the portal back at Rick's room. Rick bent closer, tracing the circles with his fingers, letting the water's rhythm seep into his own heartbeat. In that moment, he understood that influence need not be loud or dramatic. It could be quiet, subtle, unfolding outward from gentle attention, shaping the world not through force but through presence. Later they reached the willow at the far edge of the park. Its branches curved low, brushing the grass and forming a natural canopy of shade. Rick leaned against the trunk, feeling the texture of bark, the gentle pulse of life beneath his hands. The neighbor boy traced spirals in the dirt, each pattern delicate, ephemeral, yet full of intention. Rick realized that this was conversation, not of words, but of shared observation, a language of presence. Each mark in the soil, each breath of wind, each ripple in the water carried meaning. And in noticing it, he was learning the true measure of empathy, patience, attention, and the ability to fold oneself softly into the rhythms of the world. At home, the rituals of care continued. Rick's mother hummed softly as she moved through the kitchen, each motion deliberate, each gesture carrying warmth without urgency. He noticed how she prepared meals, how she arranged the table, the faint lavender scent that lingered in her folded cloths. Rick felt the weight of these small attentions, understanding that their quiet constancy formed the invisible architecture of connection and trust. It was in these subtle acts, repeated with care, that the strength of home and love resided. They were lessons in the art of presence, in the gentle cultivation of life's unseen threads. As evening settled, Rick returned to the portal. He sat beside it, fingers hovering above its gentle glow, feeling warmth pulse through him. He thought about the day, the neighbor boy's quiet laughter, the patterns in the stream, the whisper of leaves, the subtle attention his mother had shown in small gestures. Each observation was a soft seed, planting awareness in the fertile soil of his mind. The portal's hum seemed to respond, vibrating in quiet resonance with the patience and care he had cultivated, reflecting the depth of his attentiveness rather than beckoning toward distant worlds. Rick began to recognize the pattern in these moments, that small attentions, gentle awareness and careful observation were themselves forms of quiet heroism. He thought of empathy as a skill cultivated over time in small, deliberate acts of noticing and responding without expectation. The neighbor boy, the soft hum of his mother's presence, the delicate shimmer of creatures in the garden, the slow pulse of light across puddles, all of it was an education in the subtle art of holding space for life, for others, for understanding itself. Growth, he realized, was not measured in dramatic leaps, but in the slow, deliberate unfolding of attention and care. The stars began to hum their quiet lullaby as night fell. Rick lay by the window, notebook open, sketching the delicate patterns of the day, the curve of the willow's branches, the ripple of the stream, the shimmer of light across stones, the soft pulse of the portal in his room. Each line, each shade, each careful stroke was an act of meditation, a folding of understanding into the fabric of memory. He drew not to impress, not to master, but to honor the gentle, unseen rhythms that connected life, to celebrate the soft, patient work of noticing. Rick realized, in the stillness of night, that the portal was not a tool for exploration in the conventional sense. It was a mirror, a quiet guide reflecting back the attention, care, and patience he had cultivated. The world beyond it existed, certainly, but its true value was not in the places it led, but in the awareness it inspired within him. By learning to hold space, to notice, to fold attention into every small gesture, he was traversing worlds far larger than those that could be reached by any jump, any leap, any sudden movement. The journey was internal, luminous, unhurried. In the quiet hours, Rick exhaled, letting the days settle into memory. The neighbor boy's laughter, the gentle presence of his mother, the slow ripple of water, the soft edge of light across the park, the shimmer of the portal. All were threads in a tapestry he could only begin to see. He felt the pulse of life around him, delicate and insistent, and understood that true presence required patience, empathy, and quiet vigilance. These were the acts of heroism he could sustain, the small daily choices that mattered more than triumph, more than speed, more than spectacle. Rick leaned back against the sill, letting the hum of the portal and the rhythm of the night fold into him. Somewhere beneath the stars, beneath the gentle sway of trees, beneath the pulse of the world, he felt a quiet exhale, a sense of belonging, a recognition that patience, attention, and care were as powerful as any grand gesture. The neighbor boy's presence, the soft rituals of home, the subtle, quiet pulse of life, these were the currents he now understood, the threads along which his awareness traveled, the rhythms he learned to inhabit fully. The morning unfolded with a gentleness that made even the familiar streets seem new. Rick lingered by his window, watching the light spill softly over the rooftops, pooling in corners where shadows lingered like quiet secrets. Dust motes drifted lazily in the pale beams, turning ordinary air into a delicate dance. He felt the world shift slowly around him, and in that shift he noticed the subtle ways that time and presence intersected. Even the portal in the corner of his room pulsed more softly today, a gentle heartbeat that seemed to sync with his own, as if reminding him that observation and patience were themselves forms of quiet passage. The neighbor boy appeared shortly after, walking down the path with a measured ease that seemed tuned to the rhythm of morning light. He carried a small satchel, the edges worn and fraying, and inside were pages filled with drawings, sketches of trees, streams, and the faint silhouettes of birds in flight. Rick crouched beside him, letting his fingers hover above the pages without touching. Each stroke was a quiet conversation, a message encoded in the careful curves of pencil on paper. Rick noticed the boy's gaze linger on the smallest details, the curve of a leaf, the gentle bend of a branch, the shimmer of water reflecting sky. These moments, he understood, were not trivial. They were the quiet architecture of awareness, the subtle scaffolding of empathy and patience. They walked together, stepping lightly along the narrow paths of the park. Puddles from last night's rain caught the early sun, fractured into shifting patterns that played across stone and grass. Rick traced them with his eyes, following the faint ripples as they curved outward, reflecting the delicate light. The boy skipped a small pebble across the water, sending concentric rings rolling outward in patterns that mirrored the pulse of life itself. Rick realized then that influence did not need to be forceful. Quiet, consistent attention shaped experience in ways that were invisible but deeply felt. He placed a finger lightly in the water, letting it ride along a ripple, feeling the current of patience and care fold into his hand. By midday, they had wandered to the willow tree at the far edge of the park. Its branches hung low, brushing the ground with a gentle caress. Rick leaned back against the trunk, feeling the rough texture of bark beneath his palm, sensing the pulse of life flowing slowly through the wood. The boy crouched beside him, drawing spirals and lines in the soft soil, patterns that seemed ephemeral but full of intention. Rick watched, and in watching, he understood that this too was a form of dialogue, a quiet, unspoken conversation in which every gesture, every breath, every movement conveyed meaning. Empathy, he realized, was cultivated not in grand gestures but in these patient, deliberate acts of noticing. At home, the rhythm of care continued to shape the day. Rick's mother hummed softly as she moved through the kitchen, preparing a meal with an ease that made every small action seem like ritual. Rick noticed the deliberate pace of her hands, the way she left a faint lavender scent in her cloths, the subtle adjustments she made to light and space so that warmth and attention could flow freely. He understood that these small gestures, repeated without fanfare, were powerful in their quiet constancy. They taught him that connection, love, and presence could be expressed in the simplest of ways, if attended to carefully, if noticed fully. As the evening descended, Rick returned to the portal. Its glow was faint but steady, a gentle pulse that resonated with the hum of his own breathing. He ran his fingers along its edges, feeling warmth and subtle vibration ripple through him. He thought of the day, the neighbor boy's patient observation, the slow ripple of water in the stream, the quiet hum of his mother's presence, and felt the weight of connection fold gently into his chest. Each small act of attention, each deliberate observation was a thread woven into the quiet tapestry of life. He realized that these threads, though subtle, were the architecture of understanding, the scaffolding of empathy, and the measure of quiet heroism. Rick considered the portal in a new light. It was no longer merely a shimmering doorway to distant worlds. It had become a mirror reflecting back the attention, care, and patience he cultivated daily. The worlds beyond it existed, certainly, but their true value lay in the awareness they inspired, the quiet attentiveness that allowed him to move through life with care and presence. He did not need to cross its threshold to grow. The journey was internal, luminous and patient, unfolding through observation, through shared moments, through the deliberate act of noticing life's smallest patterns. Night settled over the town with a muted softness, brushing streets, trees, and rooftops with shades of indigo and silver. Rick lay by the window, notebook open, pencil tracing gentle lines across the page. He drew the curve of the willow branches, the shimmer of sunlight on puddles, the soft pulse of the portal in his room. Each line was an act of meditation, a quiet folding of awareness into memory. Rick was learning that to notice, to attend, to fold presence into daily life was an act of love in itself, a subtle heroism that required no recognition, no rush, no audience. He traced the edges of the portal again, feeling warmth and a gentle vibration. Somewhere beyond its shimmer were other worlds, other possibilities, but Rick understood now that the true exploration was inward. The neighbor boy's laughter, the soft hum of his mother's care, the delicate pulse of wind through trees, the ripple of water on stones, all were reminders that the vastness of life was often found not in distance, but in the depth of attention, in the patience of observation, in the quiet folding of awareness into the world. The portal pulsed in response, faint but insistent, as if acknowledging the subtle growth he had cultivated through days of quiet noticing. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the day settle into the rhythm of memory. The neighbor boy's presence, the soft rituals of home, the gentle pulse of nature, the quiet hum of the portal, all were threads in a fabric he could only begin to perceive. He felt the steady, patient rhythm of life flowing beneath him, and understood that the acts of heroism he could sustain were those that required quiet, deliberate attention, noticing, observing, attending without expectation, holding space for life, for connection, for understanding itself, somewhere in the pulse of the portal, in the shimmer of stars outside, in the faint rustle of leaves in the night. Rick felt a quiet exhale, a sense of harmony, a feeling that the rhythms of presence, empathy, and patience were themselves the true journey. The neighbor boy's laughter, the humming of his mother, the patterns of the stream, the soft edge of light, all were part of a world that unfolded slowly, insistently, beautifully, when approached with careful observation and gentle attention. The morning arrived with a fragile hush, a light so pale it seemed to tremble at the edges of the rooftops. Rick lingered at his window, letting the sun creep slowly over the familiar shapes of streets and trees. The air was thick with the faint scent of damp earth and the remnants of dew, a quiet perfume that seemed to carry whispers of yesterday's small, unnoticed moments. He breathed deeply, letting the rhythm of the world sink into him, a slow and steady pulse that mirrored the gentle thrum of the portal in the corner of his room. Its light shimmered faintly, steady and patient, a quiet companion to the unfolding day. The neighbor boy arrived soon after, walking along the path with his usual calm ease. In his satchel were new sketches, the edges curling softly from long hours of study and careful observation. He greeted Rick with a nod, a shared glance, a presence recognized without words. Together they moved through the morning, their steps soft and deliberate, letting the world open around them in a series of small, precise gestures. Rick noticed the way the boy's eyes lingered on the slow drift of clouds, the gentle arc of a bird in flight, the way the morning sun fractured into shards of gold across puddles in the park. Each observation was a small lesson in attentiveness, an echo of the quiet wisdom that had begun to unfold in Rick's life. They wandered to the stream at the edge of the park, following the gentle hum of water over stones, letting the rhythm of its flow anchor their attention. The boy picked up a pebble, letting it skip across the surface, and Rick traced the expanding ripples with a finger, feeling the subtle vibration of water against skin. He realized once again that influence did not need to be forceful, dramatic, or urgent. Quiet observation, gentle presence, and patient attention could ripple outward in ways that were unseen but deeply felt. The portal's pulse, he thought, echoed this same principle, its subtle warmth, its steady glow, a reminder that growth and connection were cultivated in the folds of small, deliberate acts. By midday, they arrived beneath the willow tree, whose low-hanging branches created a sanctuary of dappled shade. Rick leaned against the trunk, feeling the rough texture of bark beneath his palm, sensing the slow pulse of life within it. The boy crouched nearby, tracing spirals and curves in the soft earth with a stick, patterns that seemed fleeting yet full of intent. Rick watched quietly, realizing that these silent gestures formed their own language, a conversation of awareness and attention. Empathy, he thought, was not a loud or sudden thing. It was patient, subtle, and cultivated in acts of careful noticing. It was a soft skill, a quiet heroism that revealed itself over time. Back at home, the rhythm of care continued. Rick's mother moved through the kitchen with measured grace, humming softly as she prepared a meal. Rick observed the subtle choreography, the way she arranged plates, the care with which she wiped each surface, the faint lavender scent that lingered in the cloth she folded with deliberate motion. These small acts, repeated with gentle constancy, were powerful. They shaped the world quietly but profoundly, teaching Rick that presence and love could exist in gestures that were nearly invisible unless one paused long enough to notice. Each moment became a lesson in the patient cultivation of attention, in the nurturing of subtle connections that shaped life in ways no loud event could match. Evening came slowly, a soft wash of violet and indigo across the town. Rick returned to the portal, sitting beside it and letting his fingers hover above its glow. Its pulse was steady, a subtle vibration that seemed to respond to his awareness rather than command it. He thought of the day, the neighbor boy's careful observation, the stream's gentle ripples, the willow's slow sway, the deliberate attentions of his mother. Each small moment folded into him, building understanding in a quiet, deliberate rhythm. He realized that these threads of presence and care were the true scaffolding of life, the patterns of connection that mattered most, invisible but insistent. Rick reflected on the portal's purpose in this light. It had been a source of wonder and possibility, a doorway to other worlds, but now it seemed less a tool for exploration and more a mirror of awareness. The worlds beyond it existed, certainly, but the true journey was internal. It was about cultivating the subtle skills of observation, empathy, and patient presence, the quiet heroism of holding space for life as it moved gently around him. Every ripple in the water, every rustle of leaves, every soft smile or gesture of care was a universe in itself, a universe he could inhabit fully without ever stepping through the portal's shimmer. As night settled over the town, Rick lay by the window, notebook open, pencil moving slowly across the page. He drew the willow's curving branches, the shimmer of sunlight on the stream earlier in the day, the gentle ripple of puddles across the park, the faint pulse of the portal in his room. Each line was a meditation, a folding of presence into memory, a quiet reflection of life's subtle patterns. He drew to notice, to honor, to acknowledge the unseen currents of care, attention, and patience that connected him to the world. These small gestures of awareness, he realized, were the kind of magic that endured, more potent than any leap through space, more lasting than any grand act of spectacle. Rick traced the edges of the portal again, feeling warmth and a faint hum. He understood that the act of noticing was itself transformative. By paying careful attention to the world, by folding presence into each gesture, by maintaining patience and empathy, he was traversing vast landscapes of understanding. These were landscapes without borders, without time constraints, infinitely expansive in their subtlety. The neighbor boy's laughter, the quiet attentions of home, the delicate rhythms of water and wind, the slow sway of trees, all were threads that connected him to the world and to himself in ways he had only begun to grasp. In the deep stillness of night, Rick exhaled, letting the day's lessons settle into the steady rhythm of memory. The neighbor boy's quiet presence, the careful work of his mother, the gentle pulse of nature, the soft glow of the portal, all were reminders that life's depth often lies in the subtle, patient, unnoticed gestures. These were the acts of quiet heroism, the deliberate cultivation of empathy and awareness, the slow unfolding of understanding that required neither rush nor applause. He felt the pulse of the world beneath him, steady and insistent, carrying with it the reassurance that small, careful attention shapes life in the most enduring ways. Rick leaned back against the sill, eyes half closed, feeling the faint warmth of the portal and the slow hum of night folding around him. The neighbor boy's laughter, the soft hum of home, the delicate pulse of the willow and stream, all were threads in a tapestry he could only begin to perceive. Somewhere beneath the shimmer of stars, beneath the rustle of leaves, beneath the gentle rhythm of life, he felt a quiet exhale. Presence, patience, empathy, attention. These were the true journeys, the subtle heroism of living fully, deliberately, softly, beautifully. The morning light seeped through the thin curtains with a delicate insistence, painting the walls in soft streaks of gold and rose. Rick sat on the edge of his bed, letting the warmth of the sun brush his skin, listening to the faint hum of the town awakening outside. Each sound was layered, subtle, the soft scrape of a broom, a dog's distant bark, the flutter of leaves against the window. Rick inhaled deeply, aware of how the world seemed to pulse with quiet intention, each small movement resonating with life in ways he was only beginning to perceive. The portal glimmered faintly in the corner, its steady rhythm almost blending with his own heartbeat. It had become less a doorway and more a companion to the attentive mind. The neighbor boy arrived shortly after, carrying a small bundle of sketches, each page brimming with the soft observations of days past. He greeted Rick with a nod, and they wandered toward the park together, moving through familiar streets that now felt unfamiliar in their subtle textures. Rick noticed the shadow of a branch across a window, the glimmer of sunlight refracted through a puddle, the gentle sway of a fence in the wind. Each moment seemed imbued with quiet significance, a tapestry woven from subtle gestures, soft patterns, and patient attentiveness. They walked without haste, without expectation, letting the world unfold around them like a secret, revealed only to those willing to notice. They reached the stream at the edge of the park, where water traced its path over smooth stones, carrying the faint scent of wet earth and moss. The neighbor boy stooped and picked up a flat pebble, letting it skip across the surface. Rick watched the concentric circles expand outward, feeling the gentle resonance of their movement ripple through him. It occurred to him again that influence was not loud or immediate. Subtle, patient attention could ripple through the world in ways unseen, shaping experience quietly but profoundly. He touched the water, feeling its cool pulse against his skin, sensing the slow, persistent flow that mirrored the rhythms of life he had come to honor. The willow tree waited at the far edge of the park, its branches low and heavy with leaves. Rick leaned against its trunk, feeling the rough texture and the quiet pulse of sap moving through it. The neighbor boy knelt on the grass, drawing spirals in the soil with delicate care. Each line, though temporary, carried meaning. Rick realized that these small, silent gestures were forms of communication, expressions of understanding that transcended words. Empathy, he understood more fully now, was not a matter of speech, but of presence, attentive, patient, careful presence. It was a quiet skill, cultivated in the spaces between action and observation, in the folds of attention that made the world more vivid, more connected. Back home, Rick's mother hummed softly in the kitchen, preparing a meal with meticulous care. Rick observed the gentle choreography of her movements, the arrangement of plates, the careful folding of cloths, the faint scent of lavender and herbs in the air. Each gesture was deliberate, steeped in care and attention, teaching Rick the subtle art of presence and the quiet power of small acts. These rituals of home were not trivial. They were the scaffolding of empathy, the gentle framework within which love and understanding could thrive. He watched, absorbed, noticing how each small motion created a resonance that extended far beyond its immediate effect. Evening settled with a slow grace, painting the town in muted indigos and violets, soft and unhurried. Rick returned to the portal, sitting beside it with his hands hovering over its gentle glow. He reflected on the day's quiet moments. The neighbor boy's careful observations, the ripple of water across stones, the sway of willow branches, the hum of home. Each of these was a thread, weaving together a subtle network of connection and understanding. The portal pulsed faintly in response, as if acknowledging the quiet cultivation of attention and presence. It was no longer a tool for escape or adventure. It was a mirror reflecting the careful, deliberate growth of empathy and awareness. Rick's understanding of heroism had shifted. He no longer sought dramatic acts or sudden transformations. True heroism, he realized, was subtle, patient, and persistent. It lived in small attentions, in quiet observation, in the careful folding of presence into every gesture and interaction. The neighbor boy's laughter, the soft hum of his mother's movements, the ripple of water, the sway of branches, all of these were expressions of a world rich with opportunity for empathy and attentiveness. By noticing, by being present, by allowing himself to fold gently into these rhythms, Rick had discovered a form of mastery far deeper than any physical or technical skill the portal could offer. The night deepened, carrying with it the soft hum of life beyond the windows. Rick lay on the floor by the window, notebook open, pencil moving slowly across the page. He sketched the curves of willow branches, the shimmer of sunlight on water earlier in the day, the ripple patterns of puddles, the soft pulse of the portal in his room. Each line was an act of meditation, a folding of awareness into memory, a quiet reflection on the subtle patterns of life he had learned to honor. He drew to notice, to remember, to cultivate presence and patience. In this quiet work, Rick felt a deep sense of fulfillment, a recognition that these subtle threads of observation and empathy were as powerful as any portal-jumping adventure ever could be. He placed a hand gently on the edge of the portal, feeling warmth radiate through him, the faint pulse of its light echoing the rhythms of his own awareness. Beyond its shimmer lay other worlds, certainly, but he no longer felt urgency to cross into them. The true journey was internal, luminous, deliberate. It was the cultivation of patience, empathy, and attentive presence. It was found in quiet moments of observation, in shared silence, in small gestures of care, in noticing life's subtle rhythms and folding them into one's own heartbeat. The portal reflected this inner growth, not beckoning outward but echoing inward, reminding him that life's depth was in subtlety and attentiveness. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the day settle into memory. The neighbor boy's quiet presence, the careful rituals of home, the gentle pulse of nature, the soft glow of the portal, all were threads in a tapestry he was only beginning to perceive. The acts of quiet heroism, the patient cultivation of empathy, the careful folding of attention into life, these were the lessons he carried, the journey that unfolded not through movement across space, but through growth, awareness, and presence. Somewhere, in the shimmer of stars, in the rustle of leaves, in the quiet hum of night, he felt a gentle exhale, a sense of belonging, a recognition that the slow, deliberate unfolding of attention and care was the most profound exploration of all. The morning arrived quietly, carrying a softness that made even familiar streets seem gently unfamiliar. Rick lingered by the window, watching the first light seep across rooftops, pooling in corners where shadows lingered like half-forgotten memories. The town stirred with a delicate, almost imperceptible rhythm, the rustle of leaves against a fence, the distant hum of a passing bicycle, a cat weaving its path along the edge of a garden. Rick breathed slowly, letting the world settle into him, feeling the faint pulse of the portal in the corner of his room as if it were a heartbeat echoing the calm cadence of morning. The neighbor boy arrived soon after, satchel slung over his shoulder, pages curling softly from countless sketches drawn in careful observation. Rick greeted him with a nod, a quiet acknowledgement of shared presence. and together they wandered along the winding paths of the park. Rick noticed how the light played across the surfaces of puddles left from the night's rain, how subtle ripples fractured reflections of sky and tree, how shadows shifted imperceptibly across stone and soil. The boy paused to trace the edge of a leaf with his fingers, studying the subtle lines and textures, and Rick felt the resonance of patience, of careful attention fold into him. These moments, he realized, were the architecture of understanding, the quiet foundations of empathy and care. They moved toward the stream at the far edge of the park. Water traced a slow, deliberate path over smooth stones, carrying the faint scent of moss and wet earth. The boy knelt, letting a flat pebble skip lightly across the surface, watching it hop in measured arcs before settling into ripples that expanded outward, fracturing and reshaping the reflection of the sky. Rick reached down, letting his fingertips brush the water, feeling the slow, deliberate pulse of life echo against skin. Influence, he thought, was often quiet, subtle, almost invisible. Small attentions, patient presence, careful observation. These ripples extended far beyond what could be seen, shaping experience in ways that were gentle but enduring. By midday, they had arrived at the willow tree at the edge of the park, its low-hanging branches creating a sanctuary of shade and dappled light. Rick leaned against the trunk, feeling the rough texture beneath his hand, sensing the slow, steady pulse of life within. The neighbor boy traced spirals in the soil with deliberate care, patterns that seemed ephemeral but were imbued with quiet intention. Rick observed in silence, realizing that these actions were a conversation in themselves, a language of attention, patience, and empathy. Words were unnecessary. The act of noticing and responding, of being present, carried all the meaning required. Heroism, he thought, lived not in dramatic gestures but in the patient cultivation of presence and care. Back home, the quiet rituals continued. Rick's mother hummed as she moved through the kitchen, her hands performing a slow, deliberate choreography. He watched her place plates, fold cloths, and adjust the arrangement of items on the table with care. Each gesture, repeated daily, carried warmth, patience, and love. Rick realized that these small acts were far more potent than any sudden adventure or grand display. They were the scaffolding of empathy, the quiet architecture of connection, and the practice of presence made tangible. Observing her attentiveness, he felt the threads of understanding fold gently into him, reinforcing lessons he had long been discovering through quiet attention and reflection. Evening arrived in shades of muted violet and silver, brushing rooftops and trees with calm, unhurried strokes. Rick returned to the portal, sitting beside it and letting his hands hover over its gentle glow. The pulse of light echoed the day's quiet rhythms, a subtle vibration that resonated with the careful cultivation of observation and empathy. Rick reflected on the day. The neighbor boy's patience, the ripple of water, the sway of willow branches, the soft attentions of home. Each was a thread, weaving a subtle network of connection and understanding. The portal pulsed in response, faint but deliberate, as if acknowledging the quiet growth he had nurtured through deliberate observation and careful attention. Rick's conception of heroism had shifted once again. It no longer lived in outwardly dramatic acts or sudden transformations. True heroism, he realized, resided in the subtle, patient, persistent cultivation of empathy and presence. It existed in small attentions, quiet observation, and gentle responses. The neighbor boy's laughter, the hum of his mother, the ripple of the stream, the gentle sway of trees, all of these were opportunities to inhabit that quiet heroism, to fold awareness and care into the everyday. The portal's shimmer reflected these insights, reminding him that the depth of experience lay in the attentive heart rather than in leaps across space or worlds. Night deepened, carrying with it a soft resonance that filled the room and stretched beyond. Rick lay on the floor by the window, notebook open, pencil tracing the gentle curves of willow branches, the shimmer of sunlight across puddles, the subtle ripple of the stream, the faint pulse of the portal. Each line was a meditation, a folding of presence into memory, a quiet act of understanding and care. He drew not for mastery, not for display, but to honor the subtle currents of life, to practice the careful attentiveness that had become the rhythm of his existence. Rick placed a hand lightly on the edge of the portal, feeling its warmth and the faint vibration of its glow. He realized that the worlds beyond its shimmer existed, certainly, but the true journey was within. The cultivation of patience, awareness, and empathy, the deliberate act of folding presence into life, was itself a profound exploration. The neighbor boy's laughter, the soft attentions of home, the subtle rhythms of wind, water, and light, all were landscapes to traverse, infinitely expansive and luminous when approached with quiet observation. The portal reflected that inner growth, not as a beckoning outward, but as an echo inward, a reminder that depth was measured in subtlety and presence rather than distance. Rick exhaled, letting the day settle into memory. The neighbor boy's quiet presence, the careful work of his mother, the gentle pulse of nature, the soft glow of the portal. All were threads in a tapestry of understanding he was only beginning to perceive. The acts of quiet heroism, patient observation, and deliberate care were the true journeys, and he felt them ripple through him as a steady, unhurried pulse. Somewhere in the shimmer of stars, in the rustle of leaves, in the quiet heartbeat of night, Rick sensed a profound sense of belonging, a recognition that the slow, deliberate cultivation of awareness and empathy was itself the most luminous form of adventure. Night had settled like a soft, protective blanket over the town, and Rick sat by the window, tracing the shimmer of stars that flickered through the darkness. The portal in the corner glowed faintly, its pulse steady, patient, almost like a slow, reassuring breath. Tonight, he felt the weight of days behind him, the quiet accumulation of small attentions, of gentle observation, of care folded into every gesture and interaction. The neighbor boy's sketches, the ripple of the stream, the sway of the willow branches, his mother's humming, all these moments coalesced into a subtle rhythm that resonated through him, through the room, through the very air he breathed. He thought of the journey he had walked internally, not across galaxies or portals, but through the delicate landscapes of presence and empathy. Each day had been a step, measured not by distance or action, but by awareness. The morning light filtering through the curtains, the warmth of his mother's hands as she arranged the table, the neighbor boy's careful attention to leaves and stones, these were the small, luminous victories of living deliberately. Rick understood now that heroism did not demand applause. It existed quietly, in the patient cultivation of noticing, of caring, of folding oneself softly into the world without fanfare. A gentle breeze brushed the window, carrying the faint scent of wet grass and distant flowers. Rick leaned forward, feeling the rhythm of the wind, the subtle vibration of the night, as if the world itself were breathing in tandem with him. The portal pulsed faintly beside him, echoing the patterns of awareness he had nurtured, reflecting not places to be traveled, but moments to be lived fully. He realized that the true journey was a folding inward, an expanding awareness of small details, subtle patterns, and delicate connections that wove the tapestry of life. Each ripple of water, each curve of a branch, each soft murmur of home, these were the threads that had quietly stitched him into the fabric of understanding. Rick recalled the neighbor boy's laughter, soft and unhurried, a sound that carried presence more than words ever could. It was a reminder that joy could exist in the quietest forms, that connection was often found in the attentiveness of shared moments rather than grand gestures. He thought of the sketches the boy carried, pages upon pages filled with patterns, spirals, and delicate lines, each a meditation, a careful tracing of the world as it existed in patient observation. Rick felt gratitude for the boy's quiet presence, for the lessons embedded in silence, for the way attention could unfold as a soft, persistent thread through the heart. Later, the willow tree called softly to him, its branches brushing the ground in gentle arcs. Rick walked beneath them, feeling the textures of bark and leaves beneath his fingertips, noticing the way shadows pooled in the curves of its branches. The earth smelled faintly of damp roots and soil, a scent that carried memories of every day spent in observation, every ripple of water he had traced, every soft, deliberate motion of presence. He knelt in the grass, tracing lines in the soil with his fingers, feeling the quiet pulse of creation, the intimate rhythm of life unfolding in patterns often too subtle to be noticed, but profoundly felt once attention was given. Back at home, his mother hummed as she folded laundry, a rhythm that seemed to echo the pulse of the night itself. Rick watched, noticing the deliberate cadence of her hands, the gentle attention she brought to small tasks, the subtle warmth that radiated from acts unnoticed by most. These daily rituals, quiet and unremarkable to the casual eye, were the backbone of understanding, the scaffolding on which presence and empathy were built. He realized that to witness such attentiveness, to fold it into memory, to respond with patience and care, was itself a heroic act. It was the cultivation of a soft power, a quiet force that shaped life gently but persistently. The night deepened further, carrying with it a resonance that seemed to vibrate in the walls, in the air, in Rick's chest. He returned to the portal, resting his fingers lightly against its shimmer. Its glow was calm, steady, almost imperceptible, yet it pulsed with the weight of understanding and presence he had cultivated. He considered all the quiet threads of his days, the neighbor boy's laughter, the ripple of water in the stream, the sway of willow branches, his mother's humming, and felt their resonance fold into him. An intricate network of attention and care, of quiet heroism and deliberate awareness. Rick thought about the journey that had brought him here. It had never been about distance, about jumping through worlds or chasing adventure for its own sake. It had been about attention, presence, and the deliberate act of folding awareness into life. The portal had reflected that growth back at him, not as a doorway outward, but as a mirror of the depths he had cultivated within. He realized that the richness of life was in subtlety, in the quiet, patient gestures, in the gentle cultivation of connection and empathy that left traces invisible to most, but deeply felt by those who practiced it. He lay back by the window, notebook open, tracing the curves of willow branches, the shimmer of water, the patterns of light and shadow across streets and rooftops. Each line was an act of meditation, a folding of awareness into memory, a quiet act of gratitude and observation. He drew to honor the subtle currents of life, to practice presence, to witness and reflect. In this, he felt the pulse of heroism, the gentle power of noticing, the soft insistence of empathy that required neither applause nor recognition. These small threads were his journey, luminous, patient, and quietly transformative. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the night and the portal's glow fold into him. Somewhere beyond the shimmer of stars, beyond the rustle of leaves, beyond the gentle pulse of the world, he felt the quiet resonance of a life lived attentively. The neighbor boy's laughter, his mother's hum, the ripple of water, the sway of the willow, all were threads in a tapestry he could only begin to perceive. Presence, patience, attention, empathy, these were the true journeys, unfolding in gentle pulses that carried far beyond the immediate moment into the deep, subtle currents of life itself. The first light of morning seeped through the curtains in long, golden streams painting the room with a softness that felt almost sacred. Rick lay by the window, his hand resting lightly on the sill, feeling the faint pulse of the portal at the corner of the room. Its glow was steady, patient, almost as if it had learned the rhythm of his heart. Outside, the town stirred slowly. The whisper of leaves, the distant roll of a bicycle, the faint hum of early voices. Each sound carried a quiet insistence, a gentle reminder that life moved in subtle, deliberate waves, and that to notice them was to be part of their ebb and flow. The neighbor boy arrived, satchel over his shoulder, pages curling softly from hours of careful sketches. He greeted Rick with a nod, a shared glance, a connection without words. Together, they wandered through familiar streets that seemed transformed by attention, the ordinary made extraordinary by observation. Rick noticed the way sunlight fractured across puddles, casting gentle patterns on stone and soil, the subtle curve of a branch, the delicate ripple of wind through leaves. Each detail, small in isolation, formed a mosaic of quiet wonder, a map of presence and patience. He understood that this attentiveness was a form of heroism, soft and unspoken, and infinitely more enduring than any dramatic act. They reached the stream at the park's edge, where water traced its careful path over smooth stones, carrying the faint scent of moss and damp earth. The neighbor boy knelt, letting a flat stone skip across the surface, tracing its arcs as it bounded before settling into ripples that expanded outward. Rick followed the circles with a fingertip, sensing the subtle vibration of the water against his skin. Influence, he reflected, was not always loud or immediate. Quiet presence, careful observation, and deliberate attention could ripple outward far beyond what was seen, touching worlds in ways that could not be measured but were deeply felt. Beneath the willow tree, its branches heavy and low, Rick leaned against the trunk and let the rough texture ground him. The neighbor boy drew spirals in the soil with deliberate care, creating patterns that seemed ephemeral but carried quiet intent. Rick realized that these gestures, though silent, were conversations of attention and awareness. Empathy and heroism were cultivated here, in the patience of watching, in the care of noticing, in the deliberate act of folding oneself into life's subtle rhythms. Each ripple in water, each curve of a branch, each soft gesture at home became a lesson in the quiet art of presence. Back at home, the hum of his mother's movements added a gentle harmony to the day. She folded cloths, arranged plates, and prepared meals with a rhythm that was both deliberate and soothing. Rick watched, absorbing the subtle power of attention, the quiet insistence of care. These everyday rituals were potent in ways that could be overlooked by those in haste. They were the scaffolding of understanding, the quiet architecture of connection, a template for how to inhabit the world with patience and empathy. He understood that these small gestures, when observed and reflected upon, became luminous threads weaving the tapestry of life. Evening arrived with muted hues, brushing rooftops and streets with indigo and silver. Rick returned to the portal, sitting beside it, letting his hands hover over its gentle glow. The pulse of light mirrored the rhythms he had cultivated over days and weeks. Careful observation, patient attention, deliberate presence. Rick reflected on the day, the neighbor boy's laughter, the ripple of water, the sway of willow branches, his mother's gentle attentions, and felt the threads fold into him, forming a subtle network of connection and understanding. The portal responded faintly, as if acknowledging the quiet growth and heroism embedded in his awareness. Rick's notion of heroism had evolved. It was no longer found in outward, dramatic acts or leaps across worlds. It existed in subtle, persistent, patient engagement with life. The neighbor boy's presence, the gentle ripple of the stream, the sway of the willow, the soft hum of his mother. All were reminders that true heroism lived in attentive noticing and deliberate care. The portal's shimmer reflected this insight back at him, not as a beckoning to distant realms, but as a mirror to the inner landscapes he had been cultivating all along. Night deepened, carrying with it a resonance that seemed to hum through the walls, through the air, through Rick's chest. He lay by the window, notebook open, pencil tracing the delicate curves of willow branches, the shimmer of sunlight on puddles, the ripple of water, the soft glow of the portal. Each line was a meditation, a folding of awareness into memory, a quiet act of reverence for life's subtle rhythms. He drew not for recognition, not for mastery, but to honor the quiet currents of presence, patience, and empathy that had become his compass. These small, deliberate gestures were the threads of heroism he had come to know, luminous and enduring. Rick placed a hand lightly on the edge of the portal, feeling its warmth, the gentle vibration of its glow. He understood now that the worlds beyond its shimmer existed, certainly, but the true journey was inward. It was the cultivation of patience, awareness, and empathetic presence. The neighbor boy's laughter, his mother's hum, the sway of willow branches, the subtle patterns of water and light, all were landscapes to explore.
Infinitely deep, infinitely luminous when approached with careful attention.
The portal mirrored this inner growth, reminding him that depth lay not in distance, but in attentiveness, presence, and the quiet art of noticing life unfold. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the day settle into memory, feeling the portal's pulse merge with his own. The neighbor boy's quiet presence, the careful rituals of home, the gentle rhythms of nature, the soft glow of the portal, all were threads in a tapestry he could only begin to perceive fully. The acts of quiet heroism, of deliberate attention and awareness were the journeys he carried. Somewhere in the shimmer of stars, in the rustle of leaves, in the subtle pulse of night, he sensed the enduring resonance of presence. The luminous path of empathy and care, the slow, gentle rhythm of a life observed and honored. The night settled with a hush that felt almost sacred, a velvet quiet draped over rooftops and trees, over streets and alleyways, over the soft pulse of the town as it slept. Rick sat at the window, letting the faint glow of the portal spill across his notebook, tracing the edges of the pages with a careful, contemplative touch. The light was steady, patient, almost like a heartbeat, reminding him that some rhythms were constant, comforting and enduring, even when nothing else in the world seemed to be. He watched the stars blink slowly above, scattered like flecks of silver across the deep indigo sky, and felt the gentle swell of reflection rise in him, quiet and warm, like the soft embrace of memory. He thought of the days that had led him here, the long stretch of mornings, afternoons, evenings, each folded into one another with gentle patience. The neighbor boy's presence had become a quiet anchor, a reminder of observation and attention. Their walks through the park, the careful tracing of water ripples, the slow, deliberate patterns in the soil, all these small, seemingly insignificant gestures had left traces, soft impressions of empathy and awareness that had accumulated within Rick over time. Each ripple, each sketch, each laughter or hum had been a thread weaving together a tapestry of quiet understanding, a tapestry that now felt luminous in its completeness. Rick's mother hummed softly from the kitchen. Her voice carried lightly on the evening air, blending with the faint rustle of leaves outside. Her gestures were precise, deliberate, and imbued with a kind of quiet devotion that spoke louder than words. Rick watched, noticing the small things, the way she folded a cloth, the gentle placement of a plate, the softness with which she set a cup down. These daily rituals, repeated and observed over time, had become the scaffolding of understanding, the backbone of empathy, the quiet heroism that demanded neither recognition nor reward. Rick felt gratitude for these moments, the warmth of presence that seemed to linger long after they had passed. The neighbor boy arrived, his satchel of sketches now full of patterns, spirals, and observations accumulated from weeks of patient attention. He greeted Rick with a soft nod, and together they wandered through the familiar streets, letting the world reveal itself in quiet fragments, the shimmer of dew on grass, the gentle ripple of a stream reflecting starlight, the slow, deliberate sway of willow branches. Each detail held significance, a subtle resonance that only those willing to observe could perceive. Rick realized once more that the smallest attentions were often the most profound, that quiet, deliberate noticing was a form of heroism as enduring as any grand act of spectacle. They reached the willow tree at the far edge of the park, its branches drooping low and heavy with leaves, a sanctuary of shade and stillness. Rick leaned against its trunk, feeling the texture of bark beneath his fingertips, sensing the slow, patient pulse of life within. The neighbor boy traced delicate spirals in the soil with careful intention, ephemeral patterns that seemed to vanish almost as soon as they were drawn, but carried a quiet significance that lingered in the air.
Rick understood that these gestures, though silent and fleeting, were potent expressions of empathy, of presence, of deliberate attention.
Each movement, each observation, each quiet interaction was a note in a symphony of understanding that stretched far beyond what could be immediately seen. Back home, the hum of his mother's movements created a soft, reassuring cadence. She folded clothes, arranged utensils, and prepared the evening meal with a rhythm that felt like a meditation, an enduring practice of presence. Rick watched, absorbing the subtle power of attentiveness, the quiet insistence of care. These acts, repeated day after day, were the foundation of his understanding of life. Heroism, he realized, did not always demand grandeur. It resided in patience, in deliberate observation, in the folding of attention into the smallest of gestures, in the cultivation of empathy and care that could ripple outward in quiet.
Unseen ways. As night deepened, Rick returned to the portal.
Resting his hand lightly against its shimmer, its glow was steady, faint, but insistent, a mirror of the quiet growth he had nurtured in himself. Beyond the shimmer lay other worlds, certainly, but Rick no longer felt urgency to cross into them. The real journey had been internal, luminous and expansive, unfolding through small attentions, patient observation, and careful presence. The neighbor boy's laughter, his mother's hum, the sway of trees, the ripple of water, all these moments had formed landscapes as vast as any universe the portal could have led him to. Rick exhaled slowly, letting the pulse of the portal merge with the rhythm of his own awareness. He reflected on the lessons carried through days and weeks, that heroism was subtle, patient, and quiet, that empathy was cultivated in attentiveness, that presence could transform moments into something luminous, something enduring. The neighbor boy's sketches, the ripple of the stream, the sway of willow branches, his mother's careful movements, all were reminders that the depth of life lay not in distance or spectacle, but in observation, in care, in deliberate and patient attention. These threads of experience folded together had created a tapestry of understanding that was soft, persistent, and luminous. He drew once more in his notebook, pencil tracing gentle curves, delicate lines, and ephemeral patterns that captured the quiet resonance of the world around him. Each stroke was a meditation, a folding of attention into memory, a celebration of subtle heroism, of patient observation, of deliberate presence. Rick felt the gentle hum of life pulse beneath him, within him, and around him. Somewhere in the stars, somewhere in the rustle of leaves, somewhere in the slow rhythm of night, he sensed the quiet exhale of life itself. A soft acknowledgement that he had grown, quietly, steadily,
meaningfully. Rick leaned back against the sill, notebook resting beside him.
and let himself absorb the fullness of the night. The neighbor boy's quiet presence, the careful attentions of his mother, the ripple of water, the sway of willow branches, the soft glow of the portal, all were threads in a tapestry he had learned to perceive and honor. Heroism, empathy, attention, presence. They were not in grandeur, but in patience, in subtlety, in the gentle care woven into the smallest of actions. Somewhere in the world, in the quiet pulse of life, he felt a profound resonance, a deep, soft exhale, a sense of belonging, and an understanding that the slow, deliberate cultivation of awareness and care was itself the most luminous journey he could ever undertake.